So just a little bit about me. I worked in pediatric home health full-time for 6 years before I transitioned to grad school and then part-time nursing work, and got to do a lot of sleep work in my final project and just saw a really big need for that. And then I'm currently finishing up my Family Sleep Institute certified sleep consultant course that'll wrap up this summer. Outside of all things work, I really love coffee, being outdoors, and spending time with people. So some of our objectives for today are to understand the science behind sleep, identify potential barriers impacting sleep, and then learn some strategies that promote quality sleep throughout, once we kind of know what the barriers are to sleep. So kind of just a little bit of a roadmap of how we're going to get there. Today, first, I just want to touch briefly on occupational therapy and sleep and how those two kind of work together, because it's a little bit more of an emerging area of sleep. And then we'll talk about the science of sleep and just understanding like biologically how our bodies work and why and what makes us need to sleep. And then identify potential problems, some questions that we can think about during our day, and what kind of daytime behaviors look like to kind of figure out what we might need to do to fix sleep. And then we'll talk about some strategies. Probably the main reason that everyone is here is to learn some of those strategies that we can implement to help our sleep issues. So what does an occupational therapist do? Occupational therapists help individuals participate in meaningful and necessary activities of daily life. And I think that sleep is one of the huge foundations to this and is just a good building block for all areas of occupation. And within our like occupational therapy framework, sleep and rest is one area that we can address. So sleep impacts all other areas of daily life, and through the OT lens, one of the ways that we can address this is either through different person factors, the environment, and then also just the actual occupation of sleep. And as we kind of go through this presentation, we'll touch on different interventions that fit within each of these different areas. So why do we sleep? It's a really big question, and it does a lot of things for us. So sleeping allows for restoration and repair for our brain and body. It plays a role in memory consolidation. And so whenever we learn things during the day, whenever we're able to sleep at night, that really helps to cement that learning that we're doing. And the same goes for all of our kids as they're learning and developing and growing. It plays a role in growth and development. It plays a role in emotional regulation. And then it also plays a role in the strength of our immune system and really allows for our bodies to heal and be strong so that way we can fight off a lot of those germs that kids experience. So one of the things that I think is important to kind of touch on is a sleep debt and what that is. And that's just the buildup of chronic insufficient sleep. So kind of as we don't get enough sleep day after day, we kind of build up this sleep debt. And a lot of times once we have a sleep debt, we'll see a lot more of these things and maybe at a more intense level. And so some of those things that we might see in our kids is daytime sleepiness, cranky, fussy, or irritable behavior, decreased impulse control, and problems with memory, attention, decision-making, and decreased growth and development. A few sleep terminology things just to kind of touch on so that way we're familiar with it that you might hear is sleep onset, which is the time that you actually fall asleep. Sleep latency is the time between lights out and falling asleep. So for example, if your child goes to bed at 8, but they don't fall asleep until 8:30, the onset of sleep would be 8 and the sleep latency from 8 to 8:30 would be 30 minutes. Sleep association are behaviors that occur at the time of sleep onset. So what are those things that are in place as a child or even as adults that are in place as we're falling asleep? And then sleep duration is the total amount of time that we spend sleeping. And that's something we kind of look at to gauge a range of like how much sleep do kids need, do adults need, and at different ages. So there's a couple different biological factors that impact sleep. One is circadian rhythms, and our circadian rhythms are our internal body clock. And so they are slightly longer than 24 hours. And so one of the things that's important whenever we think about our circadian rhythms is getting outside in the morning first thing, or opening the blinds, turning on the lights, just getting that light exposure, because that kind of sets our clock for the day. And that impacts our sleep-wake cycles, but it also impacts our appetite and digestion, as well as our core body temperature. And then similarly to how in the morning we want to make it light and bright, at night we want to dim the lights and create a dark sleeping environment, which helps increase melatonin production, which is a hormone that we release at night. And we'll kind of, at a couple different points, talk a lot more about melatonin. And then the other thing that impacts our sleep is called our homeostatic sleep drive. And so during our awake hours, adenosine is released and it continues to build and build and build until we feel this strong pressure to go to sleep. It's also called a sleep pressure, and usually sleep pressure is the greatest at night. And so that's like whenever we have the highest drive to fall asleep. But in infants and young children, this builds up a lot faster. And so that's kind of what creates the need for younger children to nap more often than adults. And then next, kind of talk about the quality and quantity of sleep. So the timing of sleep is important to know how restorative it is. Sleeping whenever both those circadian rhythms are indicating that we need to sleep and that homeostatic sleep drive is high is when it's the easiest to fall asleep as well as get really good quality sleep. And so the amount of sleep in a 24-hour time period is unique to each individual, even within a certain like age range. There's kind of a range there. And so we'll talk later about some different things that we can look at to see kind of maybe what end of the range a child falls on. But general guidelines are 1 to 3-year-olds need about 12 to 14 hours of sleep. And these guidelines include naps too. And so that's not just nighttime sleep, that would be how much they're also napping during the day. 3 to 5-year-olds, 11 to 13 hours, 5 to 10-year-olds, 10 to 12 hours, 11 to 17-year-olds, 8.5 to 10 hours, and then adults somewhere in between 7 and 9 hours. So one of the ways that we can kind of determine our sleep needs is to look at our daytime behaviors. That can be a really big indicator of what's going on at night and if we need to kind of make some changes there. So some questions you can kind of think about: is it difficult to wake your child in the morning? Is it taking a long time? Do they keep falling back asleep? You have to go wake them up multiple times. Are they having trouble focusing at school, at home, or in therapy? Are they falling asleep while they're sitting still? So anytime you're in the car in the afternoon, are they like always falling asleep if they're past the age where they consistently nap? Are they watching TV and falling asleep? Whenever they read a book, are they falling asleep? Those can kind of be some signs that they might be a little bit too tired. And then are they having trouble controlling their emotions? One thing that is impacted by not getting enough sleep is our ability to really regulate those emotions. And so if we're seeing tantrums or big emotional outbursts, and there's not anything else that's really changing or we think is causing that, it could be related to not getting enough sleep. There's a few different types, 2 different types of sleep, and within those 2 different types of sleep, a couple different stages. This isn't like overly important for knowledge of helping kids sleep, but sometimes I think it's good to have a little bit of the background information on what's happening. And so we have non-REM sleep or non-rapid eye movement sleep, and it has 3 stages. And this is our deeper sleep that we're in. And we usually spend more time in the non-REM sleep than we do in the REM sleep. And this is a really restorative sleep that we get. And then we have REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. This is usually less of our sleep, and we transition into REM sleep after we've been in non-REM sleep. And in this stage, our muscle movements are drastically decreased, our eye movements are high, and then we have some body temperature changes that occur, as well as our heart rate might increase. And so one of the things that's important to note about this part of the science behind sleep is that as we transition from non-REM to REM sleep, we might wake up briefly, and we all do this. But if we're not able to fall back asleep right away, this is sometimes whenever we might see kids wake up more during the night, is as they're cycling between non-REM and REM sleep, because we cycle through this 4 to 6 times on an average night. They might be waking up. And so one of the things that we can do is kind of work on helping them consolidate their sleep and not have so much awake time between these different cycles. So one of the things that is important is melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that's naturally produced by our bodies that helps us to fall asleep. And the release of melatonin is triggered by darkness. And so our internal body clock, that circadian rhythm, as evening approaches, as it gets dark outside, it signals to our body to start releasing melatonin, and this melatonin can help us fall asleep. One common misconception is that melatonin only helps us fall asleep. It doesn't help us stay asleep, but sometimes we can think that it does both. But that's one of the important things with melatonin to know is it just does that falling asleep part of going to bed. It is available as a dietary supplement, and it's also widely used, and we do have quite a bit of research on that. So a little bit later, we'll kind of talk about some of that research and how you can find a quality melatonin product, and what that looks like, because there is research that shows that changes in the natural melatonin production for kids, especially with ADHD and autism, but all neurodevelopmental disabilities, their natural melatonin production is different. And so sometimes that melatonin can really help them fall asleep faster. And then just a few important underlying medical conditions, things that if you're seeing any of these, important to bring up with your primary care doctor and just see if they have any concerns or anything that they would like you to address, because it can be an important piece of the puzzle. So if they're commonly snoring, something to ask your doctor about, because that can be a common indicator of sleep apnea in kids. If they have any reflux or GERD, seizures, restless leg syndrome, parasomnias, which includes things like sleepwalking, sleep talking, night terrors, those sorts of things. Low iron levels can be a problem sometimes whenever kids aren't able to sleep well. And so that's something you can ask your doctor about, is if you have any concerns that their iron might be low, that's something you could get checked. And then any medications that might be having side effects that impact sleep is always something to kind of bring up if you're having some sleep problems. So sleep problems are a really big problem. 20 to 40% of children experience sleep problems, and then that rate increases to 50 to 80% of children with neurodevelopmental delays have sleep problems. But what I've experienced is that sleep often gets kind of pushed to the back burner of the problems, and other things that are happening during the day are getting addressed first. But as we kind of talked about daytime behaviors, sometimes it can be the sleep that is really a problem. And so it's something that we want to make sure we're looking at the whole picture, and sleep is an important part of that picture. And if kids aren't getting sleep, then families aren't getting sleep, and that's hard for everybody. And so that's something that we really want to look at. And then something that I will probably say multiple times tonight is that consistency is really important. Anytime we're making any changes, especially with some of these sleep interventions that we're going to talk about, one of the biggest things is being consistent. It's less about the specific thing that you want to do that works for your family, and more about being consistent with whatever it is that you've decided to try and implement. And then also not being afraid of doing some trial and error. We really don't know. Each kid is unique in what works for them. Each family is unique in what works for them. And so sometimes it takes some trial and error to kind of figure out what is going to work for each kid, even within the same family. So next we'll kind of transition to talking about some of those contributing issues. And so figuring out the issue is the first step in solving sleep problems. It's not a one size fits all. There's no one magic pill that will make every kid sleep. We have to really consider each child individually and each family. And so one of the things that I would just encourage you is to stay really curious and ask a lot of questions as you're trying to kind of figure out what's going on, what some of the barriers are to sleep, and how you can kind of help overcome those barriers. So one of the things I always like to recommend to start with is using a sleep log. And so what this is you're just going to track sleeping specifically, but also things to consider are, when are they eating? What are they eating right before they go to bed? What does play look like? Are they getting outside for anything? If they're older kids, what's going on at school? Is there anything stressful in their life? Those sorts of things. And then looking at outdoor time and exercise. So what you'll do for this is just keep I like to do around 3 days, but you can do whatever works for you of data and just kind of track when they're falling asleep, how often they're waking up, and this can help us learn which habits and routines have a positive impact on sleep. Because there could be things that you're already doing that helps them sleep more, but it's hard to identify those patterns without writing it down. And so writing it down is just one way that we can kind of help identify the problem. So here's just an example of a sleep diary, but you can make it as simple as you want. You can just use a pen and a paper and just jot down the date and some notes and some times. You can use the notes app on your phone. We usually all have our phones on us, and so that makes it a really easy way to kind of track that. You can use a notebook. Like I said, the sleep log, there are some apps out there, but ultimately I would just say use the system that works the best for you. Because as a tired caregiver, you don't need more stress added to your life. And so the system that works the best for you is going to be the one that you're actually able to use. So, kind of getting into some of the interventions, sleep hygiene is kind of an umbrella term for the habits and routines that promote good quality sleep. And we'll talk a lot more in detail about all of these different areas. But kind of thinking about having a consistent bedtime routine, daily exercise or movement, morning sunlight exposure after waking up, limiting caffeine intake, and what the sleeping environment looks like are all things that kind of contribute to our sleep hygiene. And they're really the place that we can kind of address and make some different changes to see if we can address sleep problems. So first, kind of going with a bedtime routine. So a bedtime routine is a short list of activities that take place prior to getting in bed that is the same each night. Having a consistent bedtime routine signals to the brain that it's time to go to bed. A bedtime routine can be anywhere from 10 to 25 minutes long. Some kids do better with a really short routine and then get right into bed, and some kids really need that longer amount of time to wind down at night. And so they might benefit more from a 25 to 30-minute routine. We also, with the bedtime routine, we really want it to start around the same time each night and to take place in the same location. And ideally, that location will be in the child's bedroom, or maybe a couple things might start outside of the child's bedroom, and then you'll move them towards their bedroom. And so that way they're kind of calming down in the space that they're going to sleep. So maybe it's not their bedroom, but wherever their sleeping space is where you want that bedtime routine to take place. In a bedtime routine, you want to include a few activities that are calming to your child. We want to keep the lights and sounds low throughout the routine. So kind of going back to that melatonin production and quieting the house. Sometimes that's something we'll do is like an hour before bed, we kind of quiet the whole house. Maybe we close the blinds, turn down the lights, do less of our really stimulating activities. And then during the routine, kind of carry that over, maybe just have like a lamp on or use more quiet toys and that sort of thing. So that way we're really preparing our body to go to sleep. And then another important thing with the bedtime routine is completing the activities in the same order each night. If we repeat the bedtime routine and every night it's that we brush our teeth, then we put on our pajamas, then we read a book, those things signal to the brain like, okay, we're preparing for bed. And that can kind of help with the wind down process. And it also helps not have anything unexpected. They just know like this is what we do every night. There's nothing that's going to be out of the ordinary that's going to throw off the routine for your child. They can have really clear expectations on what bedtime is going to look like. And then we want to use simple and consistent phrases during the bedtime routine. So kind of maybe you have a few phrases that you like, and that's just something you kind of stick with whenever you're putting them into bed. Maybe you have a short little phrase such as I love you, good night, I'll see you in the morning. And that's just kind of like the phrase that you use. It can be anything that works for your family, but simpler language at bedtime is always beneficial. And then put the most difficult or stimulating activities first in the routine. We really want it to go from like more stimulating to more calming as we get closer to bedtime and kind of preparing our body for sleep. So just some ideas of things that as you're thinking about implementing a bedtime routine, if that's something you want to do, some things that are better to avoid if we can, and then just some ideas that might be helpful to include in that routine. And so one of the things we want to avoid if we can is screens or electronic use. Screens emit a lot of that blue light, and that can really dampen that melatonin production and make it harder to go to bed. So if we can put them earlier in the day, earlier in the evening, rather than right before bed, that's always ideal. Any activities that excite or stimulate your child, we love for them to have fun and get that energy out, but getting all wound up right before bed is not always the best time to do that. And so moving those things earlier into the day can help with bedtime. Avoiding too many loud toys or activities or bright lights, and just kind of that going back to that idea of just having quieting the house, calming our bodies before we go to bed. Exercise or excessive movement. This is something that really helps sleep, but it doesn't help sleep whenever it's right before bed. And so that's something that if we're going to do some exercise, do it in the morning, in the middle of the day, earlier in the evening, and just avoid it right before bed. And then one of the other things is any difficult activities that can cause frustration. And so, for example, one of the common things on a bedtime routine is brushing teeth, but I've worked with some kids where brushing their teeth is a really hard skill for them and it doesn't go well. And so if that's the case, then that's something we just don't include in the bedtime routine. Maybe after dinner we brush our teeth, then we go play for a little bit, and then later we start our bedtime routine, so that way they're not dealing with having to do really hard, frustrating activities right before they're trying to like calm themselves down and get to bed. But if brushing their teeth isn't something that's a problem, brushing your teeth, putting on your pajamas, taking a warm bath, reading a book or two, using a social story in the bedtime routine can be good. Some kids really like having a personalized story that's talking about how they're going to go to sleep. They're going to stay in their bed all night. Whenever they wake up, they're going to do whatever it is that they like to look forward to in the morning. But having that personalized story to them can be a really special thing to have at night. Drawing or coloring, and then listening to classical music. Putting babies or stuffed animals to bed by putting a blanket over them is something that some kids really like. Maybe they have a bunch of animals and they're afraid that their just toys are going to have so much fun without them while they're trying to sleep. And so that can be a way. It's like all of our babies, all of our stuffies go to bed, and then we go to bed. A massage with lotion, this is one of those things that it really is child dependent. Some kids, this is really calming, and some kids, this is really stimulating. And so you probably know your child the best. You do know your child the best. And so this is one of those things that you can implement if it's something that they like, and if it's something that's stimulating, we don't want to include it. Carrying heavy items such as putting toys or laundry away. Maybe you fill up a laundry basket with all of their toys that they've played with throughout the day, and then they've scoot it on the floor towards their bedroom. And then kind of along those same lines, you can do some different yoga moves. There's some fun little handouts and books on like kids yoga. And sometimes just getting that like input of doing some yoga and doing some deep breathing can be a good thing to include in a bedtime routine. So as we implement a bedtime routine, it can be something that's new and challenging for kids. And so some of the things that we can do to kind of help smooth that transition is to include your child in selecting the activities. So maybe you give them a choice between 3 different things that you know are calming to them, and they get to pick which one, or they can help you pick which order if you don't really have a preference on which order certain things go in. Sometimes a visual schedule with each step of the routine can be really helpful. I've put a picture here of one where they close it after they do each step. But if your child has ever used a visual schedule or a checklist for anything else, like a morning routine or chore list or anything like that, you can carry that over and just put the bedtime routine into that, but kind of having a visual schedule that you can point them back to whenever it's like, what's next? It kind of helps them feel like they're more in control of it because they have their own schedule that they're following. And then something else that can be really helpful as you're kind of thinking about making some changes to sleep is to have what we call a family meeting. And so you kind of come up with your little list of sleep rules. It can include maybe like the bedtime that your child goes to bed, what bedtime looks like, what that bedtime routine looks like, just 2 or 3 different things. And you can introduce the visual schedule if you're choosing to use that at this, and then plan a time that the whole family can get together. Include siblings. It's a fun way to make the whole family there, and it can be as simple as writing out the list of rules on a blank piece of paper and having a little family 5-minute family meeting where you're kind of introducing what the new plan is and maybe do that a day or two before you introduce it and implement it. So that way they have some time to really think about what it's going to be, and it's not something that's totally new and overwhelming to your child whenever you implement it. And then lastly, just be consistent. Whatever your routine is, you want it to be something that you can be consistent with. And so if maybe what works best for you right now is to have a really simple routine with one or two things that you know you can do each night, then that's better than having 15 different things that are hard to stay consistent with. And so that's really what we're looking for with our bedtime routine, is for it to be consistent and calming. Then whenever we're thinking about different daytime activities um, that can impact our sleep, activities and routines that we do throughout the day can have a really big impact on how we're sleeping at night. And so that morning sunlight can be a big thing. Preferably, we're getting outdoors in the morning. As it gets warmer, that's a little bit easier to do than it is in the winter. But if you're not able to get outside in the sun, you can also open the blinds and turn on the lights and just make it light and bright inside. And that really helps set those circadian rhythms. And then they also have sunlight lamps if that's something that would be a little bit better than being able to go outside. If that's not feasible, you can use a sunlight lamp to get that sunlight to really set those circadian rhythms. There is research that shows that exercise, movement, or active play improves sleep. We just want to avoid this too close to bedtime. And with this, we really want to be creative. Maybe you have a child that the idea of exercise is just like, no, I do not want to do that. And so make it fun, make it into a game. It can be more play based. It doesn't have to be a physical exercise of like, we're going out and we're running a mile. We just really want to play into what they're interested in and get them moving, so that way it really makes their body need that restoration and that good deep sleep. If we're doing any sort of caffeine, we want to limit that to before 12 p.m. So that way that lingering caffeine doesn't impact our sleep drive in the evening. We want to end naps by 4 p.m. to prevent any interference with bedtime. This doesn't go for kids that are younger, some younger babies. Newborns are on their own sleep cycles, and then younger babies often take a cat nap in the evening, but for a little bit older kids, sometimes a later nap can interfere with bedtime. The one thing I do want to say with that, though, is if you have a child that's napping past 4 p.m. and is not having any sleep problems, then it's probably fine that they're sleeping past 4 p.m. Our big thing with naps after 4 p.m. is whenever we're having sleep problems at night, then we're kind of looking at that 4 p.m. bedtime having a problem and interfering with that. And then the next one can be a hard one, but waking up within an hour of the same time each day, even on the weekends, I know it can be really tempting to want to sleep in on the weekends and kind of catch up on that sleep, but it really helps to set our circadian rhythms. It helps us to get that good quality sleep whenever their circadian rhythms are telling us to sleep, and that drive to sleep is also high if we stay on a consistent schedule all the time with a little bit of flexibility in there. And then again, just limiting screen use 1 to 2 hours before bed. I know this one can be really hard. I fall into it myself, wanting to just scroll on my phone, but if we can limit that screen use, it'll really help with that melatonin production. Next, kind of looking at more environmental aspects of sleep. And so we want to create a dark sleeping space. So that way that melatonin production can be high and there's no light that's really interfering with our sleep whenever we wake up in the middle of the night, or those early morning wake ups sometimes can be because there's different light coming in. And so we want to kind of go into the room and evaluate it for ourselves, and kind of like maybe even lay in your child's bed and see like what lights are on, what might they be seeing. Because there can be a lot of lights that come from different things, like things that are electronics that are plugged in or different things like that. You can always just put like a little piece of electrical tape, or like cut a piece of cardboard and tape over the little light that's in the way. And then windows are a big thing. And so we want to cover the windows if we can with room darkening shades. Some people use foil or cardboard and just tape it up. Sometimes that can be a good temporary use. So maybe you want to just trial it and see, does the dark room make any difference? And so you can darken it. And then if that works and you're wanting to invest, then you can invest in room darkening shades after you kind of know that that works good. And then if you do choose to use a nightlight, some kids really want a nightlight on. If you can use a pink or orange toned light, that's going to be better than like a bright white or blue light. Just again, because of that like melatonin production and kind of mimicking what a dim light looks like. There's some other environmental considerations that we want to think about. The room temperature, a cool room temperature of 65 to 72 degrees provides the best sleeping environment. And then we want to consider how sounds inside the house or outdoors may impact sleep. If a child's consistently waking up at 5 a.m. and there's a dump truck that comes by at 5 a.m. every day, that could be part of the cause of that early morning wake up. And so just thinking about different sounds that are occurring at night. And then also thinking about different smells that are happening. Some smells are calming, some are really alerting. Maybe there's a smell that your child doesn't like, and that's a smell that's interfering with their sleep. Kids are all very different on how sensitive they are to different things, but it's just something else to consider whenever we're looking at sleep. And then finally, we want to think about what objects are in the sleeping space. Some children really love to have like a preferred toy or stuffed animal in their bed, but often it's not uncommon to end up with a whole bunch of toys or stuffed animals in bed. And so just looking at what all is actually in the space that they're sleeping in, and is there too much in the sleeping space that it's becoming distracting and we need to cut it back. And maybe that's something you include in your sleep rules, is that like we sleep with 2 stuffed animals at night or something like that to kind of help set a limit on that. Something that can help with some of the noises that your child might experience is a sound machine. It can be an effective way to prevent sensitive sleepers from waking up during the night. Just a couple of ways to implement a sound machine: keeping it 7 feet away or as far as the sleeping space will allow. So that way your child doesn't have too much loud, consistent sound right next to them, maintaining a volume of 50 decibels or less. And then we want to keep the sound on a loop the entire night. And so we don't want a sound that's on that then stops in the middle of the night, because if your child wakes up, maybe between those sleep cycles, and the sound that was on while they're sleeping isn't on, it might be harder for them to fall asleep. And so we just want it to be consistent all night long on that loop. And then some different sound preferences that are out there. There's white noise, pink noise, or brown noise. Some sound machines have the different sounds on the same sound machine. White is a little bit more of a staticky noise. Pink noise is a little bit lower pitched. Brown noise is kind of a deeper sound, but all are really good for sleep. So if any of those are something you come across, they're really good options. Just that repetitive sound without words is the best for sleep. So that way there's nothing that's kind of interfering with sleep. Another option is you can use a fan as white noise. Some people, I know a lot of adults even love having a fan on for the noise that it provides. And so that can be an alternative to a sound machine as well. And then one thing just to kind of touch on that's important, I think, especially for artistic individuals, is sensory processing and sensory preferences. So sensory processing is how we take in the world around us. Each person has unique sensory preferences, and this includes sensations such as lights, sounds, movement, touch, and it can impact all of us differently. And even within those, we might be sensitive to some sounds or some movement or some touch, but not all of it. And then these sensations can also have an impact on sleep as well. So whenever thinking about sensory considerations within the sleeping environment, some of the things that we're going to look at are the types of sheets or blankets that we're using. Do our children like heavy blankets or light blankets better? Is there a certain texture on the blanket that's itchy, and maybe they're up in the middle of the night because the blanket's feeling itchy? Would they benefit from some more compression? There's some like Lycra sheets that you can get that kind of give that good deep pressure while you're sleeping. Considering what kind of clothing or even the tags within clothes your child's wearing. So is it like an itchy tag? Does the tag need to be cut out? Is the material too heavy or too thin? Thinking through those different considerations. And then kind of related to some of the things we talked about in the bedtime routine, but looking at what activities are they doing before bed? Are they doing something every night that's really alerting and that it's taking them a long time to wind down from that? Or are they doing more activities that are calming during the night? And then lights and sounds, kind of like we already touched on. Some kids are really sensitive to these, and some kids can sleep with all the lights on and it doesn't bother them at all. And so it's just kind of a trial and error and figuring out what works, but something to consider with each child. Next, some strategies for staying in the bedroom, sometimes especially for older kids. This can be a problem where they're coming out of the bedroom, you put them in bed, then they're coming out all the time. And so one strategy we can use for this is a bedtime pass. And so this is a pass that your child can use to get out of their bed after the bedtime routine has been completed. So when they leave the room, maybe they give the caregiver the bedtime pass, and then that's their like way out. Sometimes people will, if they have a bedtime pass in the morning, they can use rewards. Some people don't like rewards, so it's not something you have to do to implement a bedtime pass. One of the things that we've done with a lot of families for the bedtime pass is getting a bedtime pass, and if they still have it in the morning, then maybe they get to do something special like make muffins for breakfast or help with some sort of quality time activity that maybe they don't get to do every day because everybody's sleeping more. And whenever we sleep more, we get to do more things like this because we have the energy for it. And that sort of thing can be a good way to reward that with the bedtime pass. You can decide what is a reasonable amount of passes for you. Maybe it's just one, maybe two or three is a good number. And you can just use a piece of paper. You could make a bedtime pass, just be a little card that they give you, just something so they have something physical and visual to look at to know that this is their bedtime pass. And that's what they have to give you in order to leave the room after bedtime. Another thing that we can use is an okay to wake clock. And so this is a clock that changes colors to indicate when bedtime is and when it's time to be awake. Red is often used to indicate bedtime and green to indicate okay to wake, but you can feel free. Some of them have a lot of different colors. Maybe you use your favorite child's color for one. But the visual aid can help children who are unaware of the time. Sometimes if we wake up in the middle of the night and they don't have a clock, and they just don't have a sense of time, they might not know that it's 4 a.m. and it's not time to get up and play because they're awake and it feels like it's time to get up and play. And so this can be a good visual aid that you can use to help them indicate whenever the clock's red, that means it's not time to get up yet. We want to wait until the clock is green, and that means we can get up. Or maybe the clock is off and we can't get out of bed until it turns green. Um, a way to successfully implement an okay to wake clock is to set it for the time that they're currently waking up or close to it rather than the time that maybe you want them to wake up. So that way they have a quick success. So if they're currently waking up at 5:30 and you would like for them to wake up at 6:30, maybe the first two nights you set the clock for 5:30, at the next after that you set it for 5:45 and just change it by 15 minutes so that way they're getting to have those small successes along the way and it's not this huge, oh, all of a sudden we have to stay in bed for an extra hour. Can be an easier way to implement that. And then we'll touch on some melatonin supplements. So melatonin is a supplement that can be used to help with falling asleep. It does not help with staying asleep. Research varies on a recommended dose. We want to start with a low dose though, and then increase as needed. Most kids don't need more than 3 to 6 milligrams, but with melatonin, it's something that we always want you to refer to your healthcare provider, ask them before starting, even though it is a dietary supplement and you can just get it off the shelf. We want to make sure that it's not going to interact with any medication, and they might have some ideas of what would be a good dose to start with for your child. It's not habit forming, and research indicates that it's safe to use short term, but there is still some research emerging on the impacts of long term use. specifically on puberty, but one study has found it to be safe for at least a 2-year time frame, and I expect that more research will continue to emerge on that as it grows in popularity. But research does show a positive impact on sleep with melatonin use in conjunction with other interventions. So selecting and using melatonin supplements, something that we want to consider is that it is a dietary supplement, which just means that it's not monitored by the FDA. So with melatonin, it's really important to look at the quality of what we're getting. So a couple of things that you can look for is if it either has a USP, NSF, CLCO, or if it says that it's third-party tested. This just ensures that someone else outside of the company has checked the melatonin to make sure that what the label says it has is what it actually contains. And then also something to note with melatonin is sometimes it'll have other things in it, maybe magnesium or some other supplements beyond just melatonin. So if you're looking for a supplement that only contains melatonin, then that's something we want to make sure that we look at and read the label on there to see what exactly we're getting. Whenever we give melatonin, we want to give it 30 to 90 minutes prior to bedtime. And that will help it to reach its activation level by the time we're ready for our kids to fall asleep. And then we want to implement a bedtime routine or other behavioral strategies alongside the melatonin. It can help with falling asleep, but it works best in conjunction with other different behavioral strategies to improve sleep. It comes in a lot of different forms: liquids, gummies, capsules, a lot of different dosing. So it's pretty widely available in a form that would hopefully work for your child. Some of the most common side effects with melatonin are morning drowsiness, headaches, and increased nighttime bedwetting, just some things to look out for. But again, with all of the melatonin use, we want to make sure that we're referring to our healthcare provider before you're implementing something like melatonin. And then lastly, just some things to think about as we're implementing new strategies. We want to stay consistent with any new strategies so that way we can have success with it. Change can be overwhelming and difficult in any situation, but whenever you're already not sleeping well, it can be even harder to be consistent. And then especially in the middle of the night, that can be really challenging. And so maybe start with 1 or 2 ideas that sound like something that would be helpful, and then you can go from there. And then try something for a few days or up to a week, because it might not be successful on the first night. There might be more resistance if you're doing some sort of like behavior change. So we want to make sure that while we're doing trial and error, we're giving it enough time to see if it's really going to work before we just give up on it. But also don't be afraid to not do something if you've tried it for a week or 2 and it's not working and it's making things worse and you just don't feel like it's the right fit for your child. Then you can kind of make some changes from there. And then lastly, I think it's always a good thing to talk to other providers that you work with if your child is in any therapies, or if they have other caregivers that are working with them, or if you have a good relationship with anybody at the school. Those can be good places to kind of ask and see what's going on with their behaviors at school, or what strategies they've tried at school that might be helpful to implement at home as well whenever you're thinking through different things for sleep.
And we still have a couple of moments for anyone who has any questions. We have a comment from Jesse saying, I've heard mixed things about melatonin affecting their sleep once their body gets used to it.
I haven't had any issues with that, but that's not to say that that hasn't been something that someone's experienced. A lot of the research that I've looked at talks about how it's like not habit forming, but I think there's also a lot of things that go into melatonin and sleep, and melatonin by itself isn't always the best. And so if we're looking at it with other interventions or how maybe like other things have switched around, then that could also be that it's kind of impacting it in that way. But again, I see the comment there about it blocking the body's natural creation. And that's something too, just in the, I'm not going to say that it's like not out there, and there's some other stuff in the research that I've read about it. I haven't come across that. That if we're kind of doing those things, creating a darker environment and that sort of thing to help with the nighttime natural production of melatonin, then it can still be a good way to benefit it. But there's lots of stuff out there too.
Okay. So thank you. Do we have